Welcome to my channel, and enjoy watching. She was the pilot no one trusted, mocked as dead weight, and left on the sidelines, until 540 Marines were trapped in a kill box with no way out. When doctrine said wait and command said hold, one woman defied orders, took her Warthog into hell, and carved a corridor of survival. The memory comes back to me most nights. 540 Marines caught in a valley, ridges above us burning with enemy muzzles. Ammunition running low, hope running lower. Command already whispering the word casualty before the fight had finished. The official line said to wait. Doctrine said to hold. Waiting, to me, sounded like a death sentence. That was the moment I broke silence. That was the moment I refused the script. But if you want to understand why I acted, why I took a Warthog into a valley no sane pilot would touch, you need to know who I was before Blackthorn Valley. You need to know what it felt like to be overlooked, underestimated, and written off as dead weight. I'm Captain Elena Ramirez, United States Air Force, A-10 pilot. At least, that's what my papers say. For most of my career, my presence on a flight line was treated like a clerical error. Too small, too quiet, too disciplined in a culture that celebrated swagger. You could see it in the chow hall back at Camp Hargrave. Marines crowded around tables, trays piled with food, laughter bouncing off concrete walls. I'd sit apart, cross-legged on a tarp with my kneeboard balanced against my thigh, flight helmet beside me. I never craved company. Precision was my company. Every night, I logged notes about the A-10 like scripture. Cannon harmonics at different altitudes, recoil patterns, fuel burn in desert heat. My Warthog wasn't just an aircraft. It was an extension of my focus. When I gripped the stick, it felt as though the machine and I shared the same bloodstream. Not that it mattered to anyone else. One evening, two lance corporals strutted past where I sat with my notes. There's the quota pilot. One muttered, loud enough to cut through the hum. Paper wings, the other chuckled. Lucky cardboard doesn't pull a trigger. They didn't stop. They didn't expect me to answer. I didn't. I just scribbled another line into my kneeboard, steady as ever. That was how it usually went. Insults whispered in barracks, muttered in briefings, dropped in the smoke pit. Deadweight. Mascot. Admin pilot. Even senior NCOs shrugged me off. Keep Ramirez on logistics, one sergeant told an ops officer. She's fine in the simulator, but don't put her in a fight. And so they didn't. I tracked radios, ferried gear, filed reports. They boxed me in, polite but firm, convinced my presence in the cockpit was a mistake that needed managing. But I didn't stop. While others traded jokes in the smoke pit, I spread charts under the red glow of a flashlight and memorized terrain until the valleys lived in my head. I learned how winds shifted by hour and season, how canyon cuts bent rotor wash, how the GAU-8 breathed differently under desert heat. Every number, every calculation, went into my little green kneeboard. Handwritten tables of weapons employment, trim notes, contingencies in case the avionics went dark. That notebook wasn't busy work. It was doctrine mine. No one ever asked to see it. No one wanted to believe I had doctrine at all. Hidden under my sleeve was a tattoo I rarely showed. A set of pilot wings etched around a tiny Warthog silhouette. I had earned it through the kind of training that broke people who hesitated, training that demanded perfection. But at Hargrave, I kept the sleeve low. No need to give anyone another reason to sneer. That was my paradox. I didn't fight their insults with words. I didn't argue or demand respect. I carried their doubt the same way I carried a checklist. Quietly, carefully, patiently. Because I knew there would come a moment when silence would no longer serve. My story didn't start in Blackthorn Valley. It started in Santa Fe, New Mexico. My father, an ex-Marine turned ranch hand, raised me with discipline hammered straight into the bone. Evenings smelled of dust and mesquite. Dawn meant chores before breakfast. Dusk meant fence repairs, and when work was done, he lined up soda cans on posts and handed me his old hunting rifle. Steady breath, he'd say. Ease the trigger. Let the shot surprise you. By 12, I could clear every can at 50 yards. By 16, I was out shooting grown men who came to hunt. My father didn't brag. He didn't need to. His eyes carried the pride he never said aloud. When cancer took him during my senior year, I enlisted partly to honor him and partly to prove that discipline could carry me where nothing else could. I earned an A, 10 slot through blood and sweat. But in the field, paper credentials never outweighed opinions carved in stone. And so, I carried my kneeboard back to the flight line each night. I endured whispers while others carried swagger. I built my doctrine alone, waiting for a moment when someone's life would depend on the pages no one had ever read. That moment came the day 540 Marines marched into Blackthorn Valley. But that's for later. For now, all you need to understand is this. I was never the loudest voice in the room, never the one others wanted on their team, never the pilot they trusted with a fight. I was the ghost on the edge of the compound, the one writing numbers in a notebook under red light while laughter echoed from the chow hall. And when the valley closed its jaws on them, that ghost was the only one left who could see the geometry clear enough to carve a way out. The compound at Hargrave moved like a machine most days. Patrols rolled out, convoys returned with dust clinging to their flanks, reports stacked on desks, and the mess line repeated the same clipped rituals of trays and coffee. To everyone else, it was routine. To me, it felt like standing outside a glass wall, watching a play I was never cast in. When the orders came down, the tone barely shifted. 480 Marines plus attachments were tasked with sweeping Blackthorn Valley. Intelligence called it a lightly defended sector. Secure it, stabilize it, move on. On paper, it looked clean. Maps on the projector showed ridges and approaches like tidy brushstrokes, open stretches waiting for convoys to roll through. The colonel painted it as routine. But when I sat in the back row of that briefing room, notebook balanced on my thigh, pencil tucked behind my ear, the contours screamed something different. Tight approaches, ridges stacking high on three sides, a narrow kill box with no exit if it snapped shut. I raised my hand. Calm, steady, the way I had been trained to hold a stick in turbulence. Sir, I said, pointing at the map, have we considered this valley could be a deliberate trap? These folds here. I traced them with my pencil. They could hide heavy positions. It's too neat, too perfect. Colonel Dwyer barely glanced at me. Captain Ramirez, your job is logistics, not strategy. That's above your grade. Laughter scattered through the room. A corporal in the second row made a scribbling motion, mocking my notes. Another whispered something to his buddy and smirked. I shut my notebook and stayed quiet. My pulse didn't spike. I didn't argue. I'd learned long ago that words only deepened their conviction that I didn't belong. The briefing rolled on, bullet points stacking like sandbags. When it ended, Marines slung rifles, adjusted helmets, and joked about how fast the sweep would be. From the back of the room, I watched them file out. Confidence radiated off them like heat. Not one of them believed the map could betray them. The next morning, dust plumes rose from convoys pushing toward the valley. The horizon blurred with the silhouettes of armored vehicles shrinking into the distance. I stood at the edge of the compound, headset around my neck, my role reduced once again to support. Monitor comms. Track fuel. Stay clear. That's all they expected from me. But the weight in my chest told me different. I had seen those contour lines in my kneeboard for weeks, traced them under red light until I knew every ridge and fold. I knew how quickly that valley could close. And still, I was left behind. Later that day, the briefing room buzzed again. Updates came in over the net. Convoys moving, positions checked, nothing out of the ordinary. Colonel Dwyer stood at the front with his pointer, dragging a red over the terrain as if the projection would obey his will. I sat in my usual seat, notebook steady on my thigh. When he paused, I lifted my hand once more. Same tone, same steadiness. Sir, this valley is a kill box, I said. These folds form intersecting fields of fire. Machine guns on the spurs, RPG teams in the draw. Once they're inside, our convoys will be pinned in a bowl. His eyes flicked to me, not to the terrain I'd traced, just to the name tape on my chest. You're here to monitor radios, Captain, not to hand out strategy. This time, the laughter was sharper. A private mimed flipping through a notebook, his buddy chuckling, as if we were back in the barracks instead of talking about lives. I pressed my fingers into the cardboard back of my kneeboard, then loosened my grip before it could turn into a fist. When the colonel clicked to the next slide, my warning was wiped off the map. On the flight line the following day, I strapped into my jet for a training exercise. Crosswinds dragged across the tarmac, pushing left to right just enough to make the gun honest. I dialed my trim, settled the reticle, and eased the trigger. The GAU-8 barked. Targets downrange shuddered. My notes ticked off the impacts: distance, wind, hold, result. Every variable logged with care. Nearby, a private muttered, "Lucky shot." A gunnery sergeant spat into the dirt. "Targets don't shoot back," he drawled. I stripped the pass from my notes and set the numbers back to 0. No defense. No protest. Just data. In the mess hall that evening, when I set down my tray, the Marines at the table across from me stood as one and moved elsewhere. Mascot in a cockpit. One of them sneered on his way out. I kept eating, spoon quiet against the bowl. Later that night, I traced the valley again in my notebook. Each line tighter, darker. Each contour cinched like a fist. By then, 540 Marines were already pushing deeper into Blackthorn Valley. The radios still chirped with routine that night. Convoy check-ins. Fuel tallies. Drone feeds showing small dots crawling across dirt. Nothing alarming yet. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew it was only a matter of time before the rhythm cracked. And when it did, I also knew no one in that room would be ready to listen. At first, it was quiet. Too quiet. The radios ticked with routine chatter. Convoys checking position, fuel reports logged, a few clipped jokes slipping between channels. Dots on the drone feed crawled along the valley floor, heat shimmer blurring the view. Everything looked like the intel brief had promised. Clean, controlled, safe. Then a single voice cut off mid-sentence. Static swallowed the rest. Another transmission overlapped, jagged at the edges. Someone shouting for dismounts. Someone else cursing at an engine that wasn't failing. And then I heard it. The sound you only ever need to hear once to recognize forever. A man's voice cracking in the middle of contact. Contact, contact, East Ridge. Static snapped again. The feed lit up. Muzzle flashes stitched angry commas across the ridges. Smoke bloomed from the draw. Convoy dots that had been crawling forward suddenly bunched together, stalled, and froze. The watch officer lowered his headset and stared at the screen like sheer focus could will the picture into something else. A lieutenant fumbled with a checklist, flipping through it with the panic of someone searching for a line that didn't exist. None of them found an answer. The command post shrank into a soundscape of shallow breathing, the click of cursors, the low hum of the generator. Then one phrase repeated, as if saying it enough could make it true. Hold position. Follow protocol. The major clung to it like scripture. Too hot inside 200 meters. No air support. A captain echoed it louder, as though volume could turn it into strategy. On a side monitor, a helmet cam trembled as its wearer dove into dirt. The horizon heaved with each breath. Rounds chewed up soil near boots. Bearings were called out, not with confidence, but desperation. I leaned forward over the rail, eyes locked on a drone angle that just teased the crown of a gun pit on the eastern spur. I counted bursts, mapped the traverse in my head, watched the way smoke bent in the wind. Colonel Dwyer asked for options. The major quoted the manual again. "We need them to bound out of the kill zone. Then we can bring steel." "They can't bound," a captain admitted, voice breaking. "Then they hold." The major snapped, as though repetition was command. Laughter had long since died. The men who had smirked in briefings now stared at their hands. Even the loudest voices went quiet, afraid to be the first to suggest something that wasn't in doctrine. I pressed my palm against the leather of my flight jacket. The feel steadied me. Not defiance, clarity. On the feed, the eastern gun pit kept sweeping bursts down a gully where Marines clawed through dirt. An RPG team in the draw adjusted their tube for a clean angle. "Too hot," the major repeated, knuckles white on the edge of the table. "Nobody's asking for bombs," I said at last. My voice didn't rise. It stayed even. "A cannon pass will do." The colonel turned just enough to look at me. Not attention, dismissal. "We are not authorizing anything inside 200 meters. It's not about authorization," I shot back. My voice was calm, almost too calm. "It's geometry. Give me a time and vector, and I'll cut their anchors without touching ours." A captain barked a laugh that choked halfway through. "You'll solve a battalion fight with cockpit math, Captain? Stay in your lane." From the doorway, a lance corporal who'd mocked me before called out, "Dead weight thinks she's Top Gun." The radios answered him, not me. "Bravo pinned. Casualties mounting. Cannot push, cannot pull back." Another voice screamed for artillery clearance. The request came late, misaligned. Smoke was suggested, then dismissed. Wind would turn it into a shroud over their own. On the drone, The gun pit's muzzle flashed again. The traverse ticked like a metronome. I knew the rhythm of its pauses. I knew the window where a cannon burst could slice clean through. By instinct, I reached for my checklist. The first sergeant near the door spotted the movement. "Captain, where are you going with that?" "Out." 200-meter rule stands, Colonel Dwyer repeated, his voice a shield. No one moved. The room had chosen waiting over deciding. Doctrine over action. But I had been patient long enough. Helmet under my arm, flight suit zipped, I walked out of the command post without waiting for permission. The compound stretched before me. Humvees dust-caked, crates stacked with fuel drums, the low thrum of distant engines. My boots struck the earth steady as a metronome. Inside my vest, my father's dog tag clicked against steel with each step. At the flight line, my Warthog waited. Pylons loaded. Ammunition secure. Cannon harmonics green. For months, they had told me I was here for support duty. For logistics. For radios. But standing at the ladder, hand on cool metal, I knew the truth. I had built my doctrine for this exact moment. And if I didn't fly, 540 Marines would never walk out of that valley alive. The engine started like a promise. Low at first, then climbing into a steady, determined keening that matched the rhythm in my chest. I ran the checklist by feel, each item a verse I'd rehearsed until the sequence lived under my skin. Canopy sealed. Hydraulics green. Cannon check. A whisper through the airframe. The GAU. 8 answering like an old friend. Ground crew moved with a choreography I'd long watched but never needed to join. Hand signals. Clipped shouts. The creak of maintenance ramps. Someone shouted a clearance that blurred into the background. I didn't need it. My world had narrowed to the glass and the HUD and the valley breathing under thin clouds of dust. When I taxied, the apron felt smaller than usual, like a stage I had never been allowed to step onto. I pushed the throttles, felt the Warthog pull at the tethers of earth, and lifted into an air that tasted of heat and spent fuel. The compound fell away, a grid of pale cement and sun-bleached tents. Behind me, the command post looked as if nothing had happened at all, men still bent over screens, as if the valley were only pixels on glass. I climbed to the ridge I'd memorized, a hidden orbit tucked low under a line of rock and scrub. From there, the valley unfurled like a wound, ridges sharp as knives, gullies dark with shadow, convoy dots tiny and frantic. Helicopters hadn't reached them yet. The corridor needed carving, and there was no other pair of hands to do it. My HUD painted the world in numbers and vectors, but the math was only part of it. Geometry and timing. Those were the tools that kept people breathing. I set my run in my head. Speed, altitude, approach angle. One pass to silence the eastern gun pit, another to disrupt the RPG team in the draw, a third to widen the lane just enough for the first helicopters to thread in. No theatrics. No excess. Focused destruction where it would save lives. I lined up on a spur that the drone had only half revealed. The gun pit sat like a tooth in shadow, traverse sweeping the gully where men huddled low. The muzzle flashed measured commas. My palms weren't shaking. The flight suit hugged my skin, oxygen mask cool and familiar. I breathed slow and even, the way my father taught me. Steady breath, surprised the shot. At 900 meters I began my run. The GAU-8's harmonics sang through the fuselage as I brought the reticle to bear. Time collapsed. I counted through the window I'd calculated, and then I poured the burst into the gully. The tracer line lanced into dust and stone. The gunner slumped. No celebratory flourish, just the small mechanical certainty of a cleared muzzle. For one brittle second, the valley seemed to hold its breath. Back on the net, the phrase rippled. Who's cutting them? Confusion, then a name. Viper 206. I didn't answer on the radio. My voice could be the shape of what I was doing. The flying had to speak. I cycled a rocket on the next run, an arc that met the RPG team before they could shoulder the launcher. The tube folded into the dirt, and a cry cut off. That was the thing about geometry. When it worked, it made room. Corridors opened like seams being split. A squad that had been locked down scrambled into motion, sprinting for cover under a sky suddenly less hostile. The killbox started to fray. Each pass bought breaths. Each breath bought a few more seconds. I kept my orbit tight and low, hugging rock and shadow the way a swimmer clings to current. Enemy optics tried to ghost me with tracer lines, but found only the hard skin of metal and the merciless rhythm of my cannon. I didn't look for glory. I looked for openings, 2 meters wider here, a few degrees shallower there. I watched rotor signatures and timed bursts so helicopters could thread the needle. There was point-blank terror to this kind of flying. Close enough to hear men coughing through the net. Close enough to watch the dirt bloom around rounds. Close enough that every miscalculation could tip the valley from corridor back to tomb. But terror sharpens, too. It forces a clarity that removes the clutter of doubts and insults and everything that had kept me sidelined for months. All that remained was task, geometry, and consequence. After the third pass, the first helicopter slid into the corridor I'd been cutting. Dust roared up in columns that momentarily swallowed everything. I tracked the lift, watched the sling lines and the medics hauling bodies, and kept the spurs honest. My HUD whispered range, rate of closure, harmonic shifts. I tuned each pass like a surgeon focusing on pulse and incision. The net erupted with questions and relief. Who's covering US? Negative CAS. Wait, Viper 206? A voice I recognized, Commander Rourke, a man who smelled like salt and authority. Cut through. Viper, hold that axis. Get these birds out. His tone shifted in a way that told me how tight time had been. Respect is a thin thing until it's earned in smoke. For the first stretch of the mission, I didn't think about Colonel Dwyer's dismissal or Lance Corporal Mark's sneer. I didn't think about the chow hall or the pilot wings under my sleeve. I thought only of vectors and wind and the men below who had started the day certain they would finish it. When I finished a pass, I wrote the numbers down on my kneeboard. Fuel burn, bursts fired, impact points. Because even miracles deserve a ledger. When I finally eased back from the corridor, there was a new sound on the net. Steady, sorted voices. Chalk was up. Wounded aboard. Corridor holding. The words dropped into the command post like something heavy and real. Something that changed the gravity of that room. I felt every eye on me as I broke orbit and turned for home. Some of the looks were incredulous, some grateful, some thin with the ache of survival. I kept my head down and my hands steady. There would be time later for faces and words. For now, duty kept me focused. Log the run, secure the aircraft, and prepare should they need me again. When I rolled back onto the apron, helicopters already hummed overhead, scarred birds bringing men out. Dust shrouded everything in a gray veil that stuck to uniforms and skin. Marines lined the path from the flight line, helmets tucked under arms, eyes not mocking but reverent. Men who had once slid away from my table now stood to attention without being told. Colonel Dwyer met me at the foot of the ladder. His jaw was tight, posture perfectly military. I felt the weight of every moment in the small space between us. You disobeyed direct orders, he said, voice sharp. Yes, sir, I answered, because that was the truth. His face shifted as if the fact of it had rearranged something in him. You saved a battalion, he said, softer now, an admission edged with something like contrition. Commander Rourke came forward then, dust streaking his uniform, eyes raw. He saluted me properly, not the clipped salute of bureaucracy, but the kind that carries memory. Viper 206, he said, low and formal. The valley owes you. I didn't accept their applause as vindication. The ledger in my pocket mattered more. Numbers, runs, precise notes that would live in a log long after applause vanished. But I also felt something settle in me, a quiet that wasn't about being seen but about being known, for once, not as an error, but as someone who did what needed doing. Inside the hangar, I began the ritual of stripping the Warthog down in my logs. I logged every cannon burst, every rocket, fuel burn, the vector of each pass. The numbers were small things, but they were mine. Proof that duty and discipline had made the difference between a valley of bodies and a corridor of survival. Outside, men murmured the name Viper 206 like it was a talisman. I walked past them with my helmet under my arm, dog tag tapping, and for the first time since Santa Fe, I felt the quiet weight of something I hadn't asked for, but had earned anyway. The valley had been a test. I had passed it not with defiance for its own sake, but with the old lessons, steady breath, patient practice, precise execution. The rest of the world could finally adjust to that fact if it wanted to. I had done what the men needed. That had to be enough. The corridor wasn't safe yet. The first helicopters had clawed in, but more were stacked, waiting for me to hold open a lane through chaos. I knew every second I bought meant another chalk of Marines lifted free. My Warthog hugged the terrain, weaving through ridges like a shadow stitched to stone. Tracers sought me, glowing threads clawing at the dark, but I kept the jet low, flat, patient. Breath steady, hands firm. One pass at a time. Each run wasn't about kills. It was about subtraction, removing one anchor point at a time. I silenced machine gunners whose lines pinned squads in place. I disrupted command nodes before their orders could harden into coordination. I picked apart the geometry until the kill box sagged under its own weight. On the net, disbelief shifted into something sharper. This isn't artillery. No drone strike I've ever seen. Who the hell's covering us? A tech whispered the answer. Viper 206. For a beat, the net went silent. You could feel the weight of recognition crackle through static. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My flying was the answer. From my perch, I watched Marines dragging their wounded to the birds, watched squads regrouping in pockets of dust. Every pass I made was a ledger entry. Seconds bought, lives unpinned, breathing space carved from stone. Enemy fire thickened as they realized the shape of what I was doing. RPG teams scrambled, muzzle flashes stitched desperate arcs. But discipline beat desperation. Half-second bursts, precise rockets, shallow climbs. The jet and I were one line of focus threading through their chaos. My sleeve snagged on cockpit metal as I adjusted trim. The cuff rode up just enough to reveal the tattoo I usually kept hidden. Pilot wings wrapped around a Warthog silhouette. Proof that I had earned this seat, whatever the world had chosen to believe. Scars on my knuckles glinted pale, burns from training that politics had tried to erase. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the corridor. Then Commander Rourke's voice cut through. Gravel thick, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. Command, this is Trident Actual. Viper 206 has us covered. Repeat, Viper 206 has us covered. The declaration settled over the net like armor. Voices steadied. Squads reported with crisp precision. Hope, after hours of survival, came alive in their tone. All units, accountability check. Rourke's order moved like a wave. At first, silence gaped where names should have been. Then one by one, voices filled the net. Bravo secured. Charlie accounted for. Delta moving to bird. When the last unit checked in, Rourke exhaled. All 540 accounted for. 0 left behind. 0 left behind. The words hit harder than any recoil. That had been the line between massacre and miracle. And somehow, I had walked it. But I didn't allow myself celebration. I scanned the ridges until the last helicopter lifted. I traced vectors until the final bird cleared the corridor. Only then did I ease off the trigger, flick the safety, and let my hands unclench from the stick. Taxiing back, I felt fatigue seep into my bones, heavier than the aircraft itself. Yet when I rolled onto the apron, the sight waiting for me cut through it all. Marines lined the flight path, helmets tucked under arms, eyes steady. Not a whisper, not a smirk, just silence weighted with respect. I descended the ladder, boots striking concrete in rhythm with my father's dog tag tapping against my vest. For the first time, no one shifted away. No one muttered. Colonel Dwyer stood at the end, posture stiff, jaw locked. You disobeyed direct orders, he said. Yes, sir. A pause. Then his voice broke, just enough to reveal something human beneath the doctrine. You saved a battalion. Dust clung to every crease of my flight suit as I walked the line of Marines. No cheers. No jeers. Just a silence heavy enough to press into the ribs. Men who once called me dead weight now stood firm, helmets tucked, eyes following me step for step. Colonel Dwyer's words still echoed. You disobeyed direct orders. You saved a battalion. He hadn't saluted. He hadn't needed to. His admission was a crack in stone. But Commander Rourke closed the distance. Grime streaked his face, eyes red from hours of smoke and dust. He raised his hand in a salute sharp as steel. Viper 206, he said, voice heavy with the kind of weight that turned a call sign into a monument. The valley owes you. Behind him, Marines lowered heads. Some whispered my name. Others murmured only Viper. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just returned the salute, my hands steady, scars bright against the evening light. Duty was done. That was enough. I slipped into the hangar while the noise outside swelled into something between applause and prayer. Inside, it was just me and the Warthog. The smell of fuel, metal, and scorched dust was familiar, comforting. I began the ritual, logging every burst, every rocket, each fuel burn scribbled into neat rows. The kneeboard that had been mocked for months was now a record of survival. My private doctrine written in graphite and sweat. I didn't write for recognition. I wrote because numbers mattered. Geometry mattered. Tomorrow, someone else's life might depend on this data. Outside, they were retelling the story already. We should have died in that valley, but Viper 206 was watching. I kept my head down and kept writing. By morning, the compound felt different. The chow hall still smelled of powdered eggs and burnt coffee, but the air had shifted. Where men once rose from tables to avoid me, they now paused, nodded, even made room. No words were said outright. Respect among warriors often comes quiet. A glance held longer than usual. A tray slid aside without sarcasm. Briefings, too, had changed. When I raised a hand, no one chuckled. Some leaned forward, waiting. Colonel Dwyer's eyes lingered longer on me now, as if finally seeing past the name tape. It wasn't vindication. It was adjustment. The kind that comes only when disbelief has been burned out by proof. That night, I pulled my father's dog tag from my vest and held it in my palm. The metal was worn smooth from years against his chest, then mine. I remembered him on the ranch in Santa Fe, lining up soda cans on fence posts. Steady breath. Ease the trigger. Let the shot surprise you. Those words had carried me through every pass in the valley. They were louder in my head than doctrine, louder than the sneers, louder than Dwyer's commands. I didn't need medals. I didn't need headlines. I only needed the quiet truth. I had done my duty. Exactly as he had taught me. Days later, when the reports were filed and the valley reduced to lines of text, I walked the flight line alone. The dust had settled, but the echoes stayed. Every ridge, every burst, every second bought, they were etched deeper than ink. Marines still spoke of Viper 206. Some whispered it like a legend, others with the raw disbelief of men who had lived when they shouldn't have. I didn't correct them. Legends belong to those who need them. For me, it was simpler. The corridor I carved wasn't built on heroics. It was built on patience, precision, and the discipline to act when silence would have buried 540 Marines. My father's dog tag tapped against my chest as I walked, steady as a heartbeat. A reminder, I wasn't waiting for recognition anymore. I had already proven the only thing that mattered, that one woman, overlooked and doubted, could change the fate of a battalion by refusing to wait for permission. The valley would remember. And so would I. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.